Hello, my name is Greg Freeberry, and for Project 1 of the Clustering Algorithms class, I decided to do my project on PSO-based clustering. Now we'll start off by defining what exactly is PSO. PSO stands for Particle Swarm Optimization, and the precise definition is a global swarm algorithm which uses multiple individual particles in parallel to explore the search space for the optimal solution. Now what all that means in general is basically that you have a multi-dimensional search space and there's little tiny particles that represent a solution that are moving about in your search space, and they move about based on equations that I'll talk about later. Now the idea for particle swarm optimization came about from watching certain swarms of animals and packs of animals work together, and this is how they kind of came up with it. Now, what PSO does is it not only uses the momentum of an individual particle, like the direction it's already moving, it also uses information of that particle's previous best solution and also of the best solution overall to move these particles around in the search space. This diagram here will give you a better representation. So here you can see this is the initial position of a particle, and up here is its final position. Now this term right here is called the momentum term, and W is just a coefficient that defines how much momentum you're going to use in the equation. Now this is just the direction the particle is already moving in. Then the next term that judges where it's going to go is called the cognitive term. Now this is the term of the previous best solution of that particular particle. So when a particle finds a best solution, then it moves elsewhere and it finds that its previous position was better, in fact, then it'll keep that as its what we call the p-best solution of that particle. And then it'll move back towards that position. And then also what is called the social term, the best solution of all the particles is stored also, and it's called the G-best, or the global best particle. And now all the particles tend to also move towards this global best as well. So you got your momentum term, your cognitive term, and your social term. You add all three of these together and you get your final position after you get your updated velocity. Here are the equations down here and explanations of how it works. Now the question is, how can we use this for clustering? So we have to start by deciding how we want to represent our particle in the search space. Now when you're doing a clustering approach, I stole a couple of Rui's slides, but I think these are really a good representation of how these particles work in a clustering manner. So as you can see here, one particle represents all the cluster centroids for that search space. Another thing with PSO-based clustering, you have to predefine how many clusters there are in the problem that you're trying to find out. So in this particular case, you have three particles, three clusters rather. And here on the first particle you can see the coordinates of each three of these particles. Now what we do is we use those update equations I showed you just previously, and then we will move these centroids around. So as you can see now, these have moved around. This is actually particle 2, and you can see it has differing centroids than the previous particle 1, but it's stored in the same manner, just a sequence of coordinates of a particle, or of a cluster centroid rather. But the main thing to keep in mind here is that each particle contains all three cluster centroids. Each cluster centroid isn't a separate particle of its own. So here's a little method of how you go through PSO-based clustering. First you'll start, well in my particular instance, you start each particle with k randomly selected cluster centroids. And what I did for my particular algorithm is I just randomly chose a data point in the data set, and I chose that to be the cluster centroid. Then I calculated the distance of each data item from each centroid and assigned it to a cluster. So what you do is you can use a couple of different distances. You can use the Euclidean distance or the Chebyshev distance. I personally use the Euclidean distance. So you find whichever you judge each data point, and whichever cluster centroid it's closest to, that's the one you associate it with. So first you assign all your data points to each cluster centroid for each particle. And then for each particle, you calculate the particle's fitness using this equation right here. I know it's probably a little hard to see, but I'll just try to explain it to you. I saw this in a few papers when I was doing my research. Basically what you do is you add up the distances of each data point that belongs to one cluster centroid. So like all the particles that belong to cluster 1, you first add up, and then you divide that by how many total points belong to that particular cluster 1. And then you do that for each cluster in your set. So you do it for cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3. And then you add all those together and you divide that by the total number of clusters that exist in the data. So that's the fitness function that I use to kind of determine how well my particles fit. Now the next step is you update the particle's best solution and update the global best solution. So what that means is you calculate the velocity of each particle individually, and then they'll all have their own independent velocity, which they'll use to move about the search space. And then you go, when it moves to its new position, you go, okay, now is this particle better than its previous position? If so, then we'll make this the new p-best position. And then you also check, oh, is this particle's new position also the best position there is that we found up to this point? If that's true, then you make it the g-best, and then so on. And you do this for each particle, and you iteratively do it for every particle. And then the next thing you do is you update the cluster centroids of a particle based on the velocity and position equation shown previously. And then you just keep doing this until you reach some sort of criterion, some fitness criterion, or you max out on your iterations. So I used this on a couple benchmark problems that I got from the UCI machine learning repository. This is the most popular one. You may have probably have seen this before. It's called the iris. And what it is it's 150 items, or irises, more iris species basically, separated into 3 different categories of 50 irises each. Now one category is linearly separable from the other 2. However, the other 2 cannot be separated. They're kind of stuck together. Now, to determine these, which one belongs in which category, we have 4 attributes, which basically means the particles have 4 dimensions to search through in their search space. Now, these particular attributes for this problem